everybody! I am finally here to film my April recap. I meant to do this a little bit ago, but I ended up getting caught up doing some other things, so you're getting it now. This is going to be basically all of the stuff that I read back in April, which was a relatively slower reading month for me compared to the other months of the year. I feel like it's a pattern though. I'm hoping my reading might pick up just a little bit in May, and I say that even full well knowing that I also have ambitions to do other things outside of reading, so who really knows? So far it's been going okay in May though, but that's for next month. Anyway, we're here to talk about the 18 things that I read in the month of April. The way I have them ordered in this video is that I'll talk about all the stuff that I read that I don't actually physically own yet, and then I'll talk about the ones that I do physically own, and then I will end with the manga. So let's get started and talk about all of the books that I read digitally or that I borrowed from the library. The first book I want to talk about is a new release. It's a 2024 release that I did end up borrowing a physical copy from the library for, and that's Tales of the Celestial Kingdom. If the author or the cover or the title looks familiar to you, you're probably right, because this is a compilation of stories that is set before, during, and after the events of the Celestial Kingdom duology by Su Lin Tan. I read that duology last year and really enjoyed it. There's just something about that duology and the plot in it, both on the fantastical adventure side and on the romance side, that really worked for me. I just had a very good time reading it, and so of course I wanted to check out the short stories that were tied to the series. I do really like that this collection gives me fairy tale vibes. Each story just brings us back into the world of the Celestial Kingdom, and we get to hang out with different characters in that world. Some characters that I was more keen on spending time with than others, I should say. I was reading the entire thing and I knew that there was going to be a story about two characters that I particularly love in that series, and I was just like anticipating that the whole time. And of course, unsurprising, that section was my favorite, and it got me very, very deep in my feelings. Like, I had so many feelings. I could also see the visuals pretty clearly for these stories in my head, not just because of the writing, but because there are actually illustrations included in the book, which I thought was a nice touch. I really love art for different series, especially the ones that I enjoy, and the way that it was incorporated here was really well done. I honestly will say though that this doesn't strictly feel like you necessarily have to read it. Like, it's not a must read, even if you're a fan of the series like I am. It's a nice extra, and you know, it's always interesting to be more immersed in that world and to have more parts of it in your mind. But if you're not super interested in some of the secondary characters, if you only care about a handful of them, I don't know that I would necessarily go out of my way to grab this one. I am glad that I ended up borrowing it from the library. The next book that I need to talk about in this section is actually not out yet. I believe it comes out sometime in June. I'll probably put the date somewhere on the screen, and that book is Of Jade and Dragons, which is by Amber Chen, and this is a debut YA novel. It is about a character named Ying, and she has always been interested in and dreamed of becoming a world-class engineer just like her dad was. Her dad is murdered at the beginning of the book, and armed only with the journal that he left her, her own wits, and a jade pendant that she took from the assassin, Ying ventures to the capital and to the Engineers Guild in particular in order to find out the truth behind what happened to her dad. So I would say that this is one of those books where I read it and I was like, this is definitely a very YA book. It is really plot driven. The pacing is pretty quick. It moves at a quick clip. And this is true right from the start, because you're really just thrown into the action. And there is a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of moving parts to this plot. Not only do you have Ying investigating this murder mystery for her dad and trying to figure out who put the target on his back and why he was even killed in the first place, you also find her learning more about the political situation in her country and the rest of the world, and also masquerading as a male in order to compete in a tournament to become part of the Engineers Guild, which is something that she's always wanted to do. So I did enjoy the different parts of the plot and like seeing all of that come together. It made for a really interesting read, because like you would go from one part of the plot to another part of the plot to another, and like I felt like I was never having any downtime, which is a good thing, I think, when you're looking for that type of story. I did enjoy like the world building. I had forgotten that this one is sort of silk punk, so that it has fantastical elements, but it also has more scientific steampunk elements to it. I thought it was a nice mix. There were some things here that reminded me of Avatar: The Last Airbender, specifically the Water Tribe. There were others that reminded me of other stories that I've enjoyed in the past, including Spin the Dawn, A Magic Steeped in Poison, Daughter of the Moon Goddess, some Tamara Pierce books. If you like any of those things, it'll probably be worth it to you to give this book a shot. I will say that it doesn't feel quite as heavy on the world and character development, so I wasn't super invested or personally connected to the characters, nor was I really getting a full sense of the world. I don't know if that's just me, maybe, because I'm used to it being executed in other ways in other books. I did get just enough to hook my interest and to keep me reading, which is always a good thing. And yeah, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed following the plot. I thought it moved very well. I thought it ended really well, which I don't know if that's going to be a popular opinion though. But I am curious to see how the series is going to continue since there is another book coming. All in all, a very strong YA debut. The next thing that I read was a novella, and it is The Fall by Ryan Cahill. This is the prequel novella to Of Blood and Fire, that particular series from him. And both my friend Danica and I decided to start with a novella just because Of Blood and Fire was supposed to be our buddy read last month. So I don't really want to go too deep into the plot, but I will say that this is a novella that also throws you right into the world. You're not handheld, you don't get, an easy build into like, these are the characters, these are the roles, this is how the magic works. This is like you are thrown right into the action, into a big incident that shapes the world that we come into when we start the actual series. And honestly, it was an exciting time. Like, I was just trying to keep up with everything that was going on, trying to sort it all out in my head, and I just got very swept up in it. It felt very much like a learn as you go sort of experience, and I think that helped drive the momentum of it. I normally don't rate novellas very high because it's really hard for me to do that when they're not already part of a pre-existing world that I already know, but this one was just like a good taste of how this author writes and the way that he is building this world, and you could just sense that this is like the beginning of an epic saga. So I did enjoy the time I spent reading The Fall. I believe you can get it for free if you sign up for his newsletter, and I did end up starting Of Blood and Fire in April, but I did finish it in May, so we'll talk about it next month. The next book I want to talk about was also a buddy read, this time with my family, and it is the last, hopefully, of our nonfiction reads for the year for now, and it is a book called Why Has Nobody Told Me This Before? In this nonfiction read, Dr. Julie Smith provides some skills that help you to navigate life's challenges and also, have a good check on your mental and emotional health as well. I have a little bit of mixed feelings about this one. I want to say I do like the way that it's sectioned. It has, I think, 8 sections, and each focuses in on one particular topic. And I did find some of the sections more interesting and personally relevant to me than some of the others might have been. There are a lot of practices and sort of beliefs that she voices that I actually feel are very familiar to me, or that I have employed myself but never been able to verbalize. Just having someone give me the words to describe what I'm doing felt really reaffirming and also reassuring in and of itself. I do feel like a lot of what is offered is very generalized, it's very introductory and beginner because, given that it's a book and there's only so much you can do with that and you're trying to appeal to a broader audience, of course your approach to things is on a general, more broad sense. And there's nothing wrong with that as well. I do think it would offer some helpful insight to other people, and it's worth checking out if you, just want to try and see if any of these concepts are ones that work or feel relatable to you, and then eventually you can deep dive into what makes the most sense. So I'm glad I read it. I don't know that it is one that I would necessarily need to keep on my shelves, but it was definitely an interesting read. Now I get to talk about all the books that I own physically that I did read. I didn't read all of them physically. Some of them I actually listened to on audiobook, but I do own the copies, which means I took them off my TBR. We are going to start with Castle in the Air, which is by Diana Wynne Jones. This is the second book in the Howl's Moving Castle series, I want to say. I love this cover, by the way. It's stunning. Anyway, Castle in the Air is about a humble carpet merchant. His name is Abdullah, and he meets and falls for this lovely individual named Flower in the Night. However, a jinn carries Flower in the Night off, and so Abdullah is determined to rescue her while avoiding all of these villains that suddenly seem to be after him. Is he gonna be able to succeed at this quest, especially if he only has an unreliable magic carpet and a bad-tempered genie to help him along the way? You'll have to read this one to find out. And I loved the experience of this one just because it gave me such nostalgic feelings when I was listening to it. It has the same energy as books that I read and reread until they fell apart in my childhood. Specifically, it kind of gave me Roald Dahl and Grimm's fairy tales in tandem. It definitely also felt like a modern fairy tale, but it was one that had a lot of humor and definitely made me crack up a time or two. Honestly, I had no idea how this was going to tie in with Howl's Moving Castle. I really did not know what the connection was going to be, but I was very amused once it was revealed. I think that was definitely something that I had no idea. Like, I genuinely could not tell you where it was going. It was just a fun time. I was really entertained, and it's so rare for me to find books that actually make me laugh out loud. This was one of them. It was an enjoyable time. Felt very fairy tale vibes. The next book is a little bit of a departure from that one, and it's because we're focusing on death magic, or magic tied to death and ghosts. And the book in question is Bonesmith by Nikki Preto, which I read with my friend Kristen. So in Bonesmith, our main character Ren has been banished to the border wall after failing the trial to become a Valkyr, which is basically a ghost fighting warrior. She, because of circumstances, finds herself traveling past the wall into the haunted wasteland in order to retrieve a kidnapped prince. I didn't immediately get hooked by this one, but as things slowly started to pick up, I definitely found myself getting more invested in Ren and discovering what was going to happen. What really hooked me though was the lore, because I thought it was interesting. I'm genuinely always drawn to stories that have death magic, necromancy, anything of that type. I don't know what that says about me, but it's the truth. And I did like learning more about the world itself, the history and the politics between the different groups in this one, as well as how the different magical things worked. The beginning felt a little bit more typical YA to me, like something I'd read before, and it did feel like the pacing was a bit slower. It really did pick up once Ren moved past the wall and started off on this journey in order to rescue the Prince Leopold. It really does just keep moving at a more steady clip after that. I don't think that I would consider any of these characters all-time favorites, but I did feel for them. I did understand the different things that had shaped who they were and what they were up against, and I liked seeing them work in tandem in order to achieve some goals here. This actually gives me the vibes a little bit of the Abhorsen series by Garth Nix, so if you like that one, you may like this one. But yeah, after the way this ends as well, I am definitely looking forward to picking up the next book and just seeing how this story wraps up. The next book that I listened to is a romance book that I've been meaning to read for a while, and I finally got to it, and that is Anne of Manhattan, which is by Brina Starler. And this book is a modern day take on the classic Anne of Green Gables, in which Anne is in her final year of graduate school in Manhattan, only to find everything disrupted by the reappearance of her arch rival Gilbert Blythe. The two of them end up assigned to the same professor for their thesis, and they end up working together on their thesis, and they still have some tension, sparks flying between them. I just found this author's take and the way that she wove details in from the original and made them a bit more modern for her purposes just so clever. It was really fun to see so many nods to things that I am familiar with as someone who has reread Anne of Green Gables multiple times. That was so fun. She really captured the spirit of these characters as well, right down to like the way they think and the way they process things and the way they choose to react to things. I felt like they was all very true to the Anne and Gilbert that I know from the original series. I definitely think this is more romantic. This is definitely more on the page romance, where you see a lot of physical interactions as well as other emotional interactions between these two. The whole time I was just like enjoying myself, kicking my little feet, because it's fun to see their dynamic play out on page, and I think Brina Starler did a pretty good job capturing that with her modern day story. I also obviously was very particularly in love with the fact that New York was such a big part of it, and books were such a big part of it, and stories were such a big part of it. That's always going to appeal to me as someone who is a book lover who also lives in NYC. It was just a special touch, really. I did find the way things happen in the third act a little bit frustrating, even though I kind of understood that it made sense with who these characters are. But yeah, it was overall an enjoyable time. I'm glad I finally got around to reading it, and I'm glad that this book exists and gives us kind of the modern Anne and Gilbert vibes that we really want. The next book is a new release, and unfortunately it didn't quite end up being a new release that worked for me, and that is How to End a Love Story, which is by Yulin Kwang. In this one, our two main characters are both writers, Helen and Grant, and they end up in the same writer's room for a TV show that is being adapted from Helen's novels. They have a complicated history, but alongside that, they also have this undeniable attraction, and so there's some tension between these two characters that remains unresolved, and Guess you'll have to see or read this if you're curious to find out if they're able to find a way to work through it. I should have expected this one to start off as heavy as it does because of the synopsis. It does feel a little more women's fiction to me than actual romance. Even though that sort of changes a little bit as the story continues, I still overall would like say it's leaning more towards that. I did like the way the author writes. There are some lines and phrases that I had to stop and mark off and reread because I thought they were pretty poignant. And I really like that, again, this one has literary touches, sort of, in that Helen is a book writer, they're both writers, and they are working on this show based on a book. I like the small town vibes as well. I like that there were some date vibes in this too. It was just nice to see that captured so well on page. And of course, I'm always soft on heroes who are very clearly into the heroine, like they undeniably have feelings for that person and don't pretend otherwise. It's just so nice to see that kind of devotion and admiration, and I really enjoyed that. I also found Helen's experience as the eldest daughter of an Asian family pretty relatable at some points too. There were just things that I honestly didn't click with as well, like the traumatic event that sort of ties the couple together. I thought they were going to be able to on page work through it more, and we would be able to see that, but we really don't get as much of that as I thought we would. I feel like we've seen the steps that they're taking and what they're trying to do. And I get that this is like years after that event happened, right? So we're not really entitled to seeing that on page, but I do feel like that since it was so unresolved, I would have liked to see more of that being tackled in the story, and it just didn't come across that way for me. And then the romance itself starts off because of the physical attraction, and I don't really have problems with that. It's just that it stayed in that area for a majority of the story. It's just hard for me to believe that there was any mutual feeling that would inspire a deeply devoted relationship between these two main characters in the end. And honestly, a part of it was like I was expecting a romance reading this, so the ending not giving me those happy, warm, fuzzy feelings that I would expect after finishing a romance also kind of downgraded it for me. Like, I still believe that they'll be happy despite the fact that they have other obstacles to face, but like, yeah, overall this one just ended up being okay for me. I had high expectations, they just didn't get met. Next, we have The Honey Witch, which is another new release for May. This is by Sydney J. Shields. In this book, Marigold Claude is whisked away by her grandmother to Innisfree to be trained as the next Honey Witch, even knowing that there is a curse on the Honey Witch that prevents anyone from falling in love with her. When grumpy, skeptical Lottie Burke crosses paths with her, she herself cannot deny the sparks flying between them, even as a threat looms over the horizon of her new home. I can see why it wouldn't work for some people because the writing is definitely a little bit clunky, especially with the dialogue. There is a sincere lack of contractions that I think is contributing to the dialogue not sounding as natural as it could be. Like, I tried reading some of it out loud and I was like, yeah, that feels a little bit awkward. And honestly, there is not so much happening in this book versus, you know, vibes, really. Like, you just see Marigold going about her day to day, learning how to become the Honey Witch, doing what she has to maintain the wards and all the magic and stuff like that. I kind of knew that was what was going to be happening going into it, but I don't know if that's an expectation that everyone else has. We really only get what's on the tin. If you've read the synopsis of this book, that is exactly what you're going to see on page. You're not going to get much more than that. I did like that there was a big tie to nature here and an appreciation for that and for other living creatures. I also got very cozy vibes just because of the setting and like the small town and the interactions between the different people. And personally, despite the fact that I could guess how the plot was going to play out, it's pretty heavy-handed on the details, I'll be honest with you. So you could pretty much guess right away. I still liked seeing how it would all play out and working it out. I know as well that one of the biggest draws of this was that there was a romance promise. And even though I do think the romantic relationship is sweet, I actually think that the way it was executed is not necessarily the best. So I'm of the mind that this was a solid debut. Like, it was good. I can see where this author can like hone their writing and improve even further in their career, so I am going to be definitely checking out whatever she does next. And then we have to talk about probably what was my favorite book of the month, and that is House of Many Ways by Diana Wynne Jones. I honestly did not expect to love this book as much as I did, but it was so good. This has a main character named Charmaine Baker, and she has been tasked to look after her grand uncle William's tiny cottage while he is away. And this should have been fairly simple, except that her uncle is also the royal wizard Norland, and his tiny cottage actually bends time and space. Soon she finds herself caught up in a very fantastical adventure, meeting some unexpected allies, making some unexpected enemies, and shenanigans ensue. Honestly, the way that Charmaine is portrayed right when we meet her at the start, she's reading a book and she's eating a pastry. I was like, this is a character that I'm gonna love, someone I would love to get to know. And honestly, the entire way through, I was just like rooting for Charmaine. Like, I'm like, you are a kindred spirit. I will follow you wherever you're going. I love your approach to things, so on and so forth. It was just so funny. Like, it does start out very humorous in that Charmaine is not very well versed in how to maintain a household or do any of the chores. She kind of has her head up in the clouds and she's so used to having things done for her. So it is good to see her character develop as she learns to tackle things, as she learns to face them head on versus like just having the blinders on and looking at her own goals. It's nice to see her learning to cooperate with other people, figuring things out. I love that she's so smart. I love that she takes no nonsense, really. It was just fun, again, to see how this one tied in with Howl's Moving Castle. I was also plenty surprised when that happened because I honestly had no clue what was going on. And again, this is another cozy, magical adventure with shenanigans up the wazoo. And if you're here for that kind of read, then I would highly recommend checking out all 3 books in this series because every adventure is just a bloody good time. I have nothing else to say except read it because it's so much fun. All right, and now we're gonna move on to the last section of this video in which I talk about the manga that I read. And I actually did complete a series, but it was because I had started it in March and I just did not finish it until April. I read the rest of the volumes of Spy X Family all the way through volume 11, which was released in March. I just have so much love for this series. The entire premise is basically about a master spy named Twilight who has been tasked to prevent a war between 2 countries because he has to make contact with a key individual. He actually has to build a family, aka find a wife and a child, in order to infiltrate a school. I'm just so delighted every time I pick up an installment of this series. There's so many capers and so much chaos. There's shenanigans that make me laugh so much that happen to this beloved family made up of Lloyd and Anya and Yor and Bond and all the characters surrounding them as well. I definitely laugh a lot while reading this series, and as I said, that's a rarity, so it is fun for me when that happens. I do think that there's a lot of exaggeration and a lot of like, I guess it's like movie style comedy in these panels, but it's such a good time. What I do forget is that there are also serious aspects to this series. Like when you get the feels because the Forgers are starting to interact as if they're a real family and actually forming these real bonds, which every time I see it, it makes my heart feel warm and fuzzy, but it also terrifies me because I'm so nervous for the day that they find out the truth about each other. And I also think like exploring the political situation and getting some of the harrowing perspectives on what Lloyd has been through, what Yor did for her sibling, like all of these things also remind you like outside of the humor and outside of like the fun stuff, there's also this serious stuff going on in the background that is being tackled. And the reason why they're all together in the first place is because they are trying to prevent conflict from blowing up. And so I love the series. I am definitely cemented in my decision to continue reading on with it, and I am curious to see where this mangaka is gonna take it. And there you have it. Those are all the things that I read in the month of April. I hope you found something new to add to your TBR list, and if you read any of the books, definitely let me know. I would love to hear your thoughts. And I am also online on all the other platforms as usual, and you can catch me in a new video soon. Bye!